What is going on, Fantasy Fam? Welcome to the Week 8 edition of Plugged In. I am your host / guest, JM to Win from OneWeekSeason.com, here with the great Scott Barrett from FantasyPoints.com. Scott, my man, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, JM?
I'm doing well. It's I did some reading yesterday, some fiction reading, and I don't typically have time to do that during football season. So after that, like my mind shifts over to thinking that I'm in relaxation mode. So like last night after Abby went to bed and I had to start getting my feet under me for the slate. And then this morning waking up and having a normal work day, I was like, I thought football season was over. It's kind of like how my mind and body felt. You know how that is? Like you push so hard for like 4 months and then you get your first break and then you think that you're going to get breaks, but you're really not. So big picture, I'm good, but kind of lagging this morning just because I thought that season was over.
Yeah, I did that. I took a little mini vacation on Sunday. I've been doing this running bit in our Discord where week 3, Devin Duvernay scores a touchdown on the kickoff and it's like the first play. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm dead. I can't believe I didn't play Devin Duvernay. Fuck this, I'm out. I'm going to go bake a quiche. And then like the next week, Devin Duvernay scores the first touchdown of the week. And I'm like, quiche season, I'm out of here. See you guys, like just as a joke. And then unironically, this Sunday was that for me. And my girlfriend and I spent all day making homemade kimchi. So just watching the games in the background. I feel amazing about like my process. I feel like I have a uniquely terrific grasp on the season as a whole, unexploited edges that I think other people are missing. I feel really good, but I had easily my worst week in over a year. I went all in on Amon-Ra St. Brown, which I thought was a play.
He didn't even get concussed. It's the whole new ataxia thing.
Yeah, which by the way, coincidentally, I'm a huge Fugazi stan, and I found out he was in a band very briefly with the bassist. John Frusciante of the Red Hot Chili Peppers was in a band with the bassist of Fugazi, and they only have like 5 songs, but they're all awesome. So I've been listening to this band nonstop. Their name, Ataxia. They're really good. Shout out to Ataxia.
Shout out to Ataxia. There you go. I last time you recommended the band was Neutral Milk Hotel. So I'll always take your recommendations. That Ataxia thing I think is going to be an issue when we get it. I mean, obviously they have to player safety is important, and the Tua Tagovailoa situation intensified the player safety. But now like Bridgewater, Amon-Ra St. Brown, both guys got taken out of their game without an actual concussion. Yeah, I had a lot of Amon-Ra St. Brown. I actually had a lot of Khalif Raymond as well. So kind of I benefited from Amon-Ra St. Brown being taken out.
You went back to our boy.
I went back to our boy. Well, and I'm like, there was so little value, right? That I'm like, okay, who can score from anywhere in the field? I had probably 10% Marquise Goodwin in my large field.
That's awesome.
Marquise Goodwin, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Nico Collins, Khalif Raymond, and Sammy Watkins. Those were the 5 guys that where it's like, hey, look, these guys can put up 20 points and nobody's going to have them. And they let me do something else. And if they miss, they don't kill me. But I mean, I had not my worst weekend ever, but I had a negative ROI. But I'll tell you this. This is what I think. This is a perfect encapsulation of what the weekend was like. So on Underdog, right? They set these second half parlays, and sometimes whatever program they use to get the lines up quickly, they get just the wrong line up. So for example, this last week, second half passing yards, they had Patrick Mahomes at 337 second half passing yards. Obviously, he's not going to throw for 337 second half passing yards, but you have to build a parlay. And it's going to be like 10, 15, 20 seconds before Underdog realizes their mistake, pulls that line and replaces it with the correct one. So you have to quickly put together this parlay and like get these other 3-4 legs correct, right? So one of the lines that they got wrong this last week was Brett Rippon's second half pass attempts at 24.5. So I quickly grabbed that and then build out this 5-leg parlay around it. You don't have time to think. You got to kind of muscle memory what correlates well. How do I think the second half will play out? I got 4 of the 5 legs right. And the one I got wrong was Brett Rippon, who threw for 28 pass attempts. Underdog came back in and quickly adjusted it down to 14.5 pass attempts because that's where it should have been. And I kind of feel like I actually had 5 different 5-leg parlays and I hit 4 legs on. And any one of those 5, if I'd hit the 5th leg, it would have been a profitable weekend. If I'd hit 2 of them, would have been like hugely profitable. But yeah, I had a profitable weekend in NFL props, profitable week in NBA props, negative ROI and DFS, and then those parlays kicked me in the face the way that they played out. But I think that's kind of like, that was to me an encapsulation of this last weekend of like, oh, like look, I get these other 4 things right on this, and this incorrect line is the one that ends up like not hitting. And I think that this weekend was kind of like that, like just things that were like, that shouldn't have happened in some places and kind of wrecked some other well-built rosters or good processes or whatever. And every week's different. There's going to be weeks like that. But yeah, it was kind of a weird weekend as a whole for sure.
Yeah, so it wasn't just Amon-Ra St. Brown for me. It was also DK Metcalf. It was Breece Hall. It was, I don't know, there was more than that as well. Players who got pulled with injury. And this comes, I guess, right, a week or 2 weeks after, Skylar smashed me. Here's, again, I felt like there wasn't too much from this past week that surprised me. And I felt like my process was good. I said on the show, Patrick Mahomes was my favorite GPP quarterback. And I talked about the wide receivers, how, an improved rapport. And it's just Mahomes being a god, that he can uplift any of these super cheap wide receivers. I talked about the 49ers defense being super fraudulent. Mariota having like 30 fantasy points and 14 pass attempts with a perfect passer rating. PJ Walker doing well the week before that. Didn't play him. I talked about Joe Burrow, how the prior week Cincinnati led the league in pass rate over expectation, which is exactly what you want to see to unlock Burrow and this passing attack. That's what got them to the Super Bowl. He went super run heavy early. It wasn't working. Then he went super pass heavy, and it brought them to a Super Bowl. The Falcons have had a bottom 5 defense against quarterbacks for 5 straight seasons, including this one. The worst pass rush in football. Didn't play him.
You need me to listen to your shows and audit them and then tell you on Saturday who to play.
Yeah, so I honestly, I talk about this all the time. I think I'm a really good lawyer, but a really bad, or like not as good of a judge. And like I see that in our Discord is, we have pros who are, making obscene amounts of money. And I've done well, but not obscene amounts of money. This past week, just, you want to finish first or last, right? Well, boy, did I finish last. So here's the lineup I went all in on. And this was Saturday night. Maybe I was just feeling a little lazy, but I only went with one lineup, really. And it was Matt Ryan stacked with Alec Pierce. And listen, I've watched tape on Matt Ryan. I know he's not good. He's like benched right now, but he also might have been hurt with a shoulder injury. Johnny was with me, and then he remembered that Matt Ryan stinks when he's not in a dome and went the other way and played Titans defense. And he won. He finished second in a tournament with Breece Hall for $20,000. And he smashed. But I was just seeing Matt Ryan at like 1% exposure. He ranks behind only Josh Allen in passing yards per game. His wide receiver 2 ranked 7th in yards per route run over the last 4 weeks. The defense he was up against was giving up 24 fantasy points per game, 4.5 yards per route run to opposing wide receiver 2s, including Alec Pierce, who had 80 yards on 15 routes the last time they played. And they were just both super cheap, super low owned. And it was one of those things where it's like, honestly, just looking at those stats, I think there's a 30% chance this hits big. And they're only going to be like 2-3% owned. So screw it. I'll just go all in. Like, I feel convicted on this to an extent. So I'll do that. And then I'll run it back with Henry, where it's like, okay, the spread's in his favor, and Henry is a lock for at least 20 every time the Titans win. Like, he'll get 100 and something yards and hit the bonus, and hopefully a couple of touchdowns. And then I went all in on Amon-Ra St. Brown, which I still feel, it was good process, bad results. Chris Godwin, who had 13 targets and did absolutely nothing with it. Cheap tight ends. And then I went DK Metcalf just because he fit the build alongside the chalky running backs I played. And I got absolutely hammered.
Yeah, well, and DK Metcalf was 6,600, and CeeDee Lamb was 6,800. So you get some nice, like a nice pivot from a super high on guy to a low on guy with similar.
Yeah, I didn't like Lamb at all. Didn't like Lockett. A lot of the chalk I faded ended up flopping, and the chalk I liked did really well. Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker. Just every like wide receiver got hurt or was terrible.
Yeah, on the Matt Ryan one. So the only reason I wasn't on it, I had him on like 1 out of 60 rosters this last week, and the reason was because Jonathan Taylor was back, and it was like, surely Frank Reich is smart enough to lean run heavy, and then he wasn't, right? So like in honesty, you're like the because I didn't think they'd call the game that way, and then they did call the game that way, and people can be like I've seen like, oh, the game flow skewed against Jonathan Taylor, and it's like, really, if you watch NFL games, when a team is down 13-0 in the first half, they don't just go pass heavy. They still run their offense, because 2 scores is nothing. If you're in the first half, you put together a drive, you score a touchdown, now you're down only 6 points. Also, the Colts did that in the third quarter. They put together a drive, they scored a touchdown, now they're down 13-7. Like, it wasn't game script that took Jonathan Taylor out of that one. It was Frank Reich that took Jonathan Taylor out of that one. And the previous week, they'd had this no huddle offense. They'd practiced all season, and they'd like kind of had in their back pocket. And then heading into week 6, they were like, look, this week it was against Washington, right? They're like, we're doing this no huddle offense no matter what. They came out and just like fast paced, no huddle offense, let Matt Ryan run the game plan, throw the ball. And so the fact that they were kind of like, hey, look, Jonathan Taylor's back, but we're still going to do the same thing. Like, that could have hit it obviously crushed you, right? But like, that could have hit at a much higher rate than probably anybody realized. And so I think that was like, it's tough to pull the trigger on something like that on one roster. But I mean, what else was there that you're going to be like, oh yeah, I'll go here instead? Obviously, Burrow was sharp. The concern there is that Zach Taylor has called games in this let's manage our way to a win type of approach. And it was like the last few games last season in the playoffs that he let Burrow throw the ball. And so if they're going to do that again, obviously Burrow's got the upside. Mahomes, super sharp call there. Really strong GPP play when nobody wanted to play him. Mahomes plus Kelsey plus, unfortunately, my thing was Mahomes plus Kelsey plus a Ravens bring back to basically say you want Mark Andrews to disappoint on your Kelsey rosters. So get that bring back. So I had some Duvernay, I had some Bateman, I had some Justice Hill that once Gus Edwards was active for 200 less than Justice Hill, I almost pivoted over and I chose not to. But no, I mean, I think that from like you said, right? You said you felt good about the weekend. And then I think the only thing to really maybe like retrospectively to be like, oh, was I wrong on that is Matt Ryan? But then realistically, they called that game in a way that would have benefited you against a defense that, I'll say this about Tennessee, they're very game plan specific, right? So sometimes you look at them and you're like, oh God, they're going to get smashed. And then they dominate. And other times you're like, there's no way that Tennessee defense does poorly here. And then they get smashed because just whatever game plan they have for that game ends up not working. But no, I mean, I think that that's a good way to approach things, especially retrospectively when we saw how Frank Reich called that game, how the Colts approached things. It just clearly didn't work out for you.
Yeah, I mean, like, I wasn't upset at all. Like, it was just, I went going into it knowing, like, low probability of winning, but if this hits, I win huge. And then, Amon-Ra St. Brown goes down, and it's just like, oh, okay, this isn't my week. That's fine. And again, I felt good about the process overall. It's just, hey, he ranks behind only Josh Allen in yards per game. Tennessee's giving up the most yards per game. No one else is on it. And it's like, sure, there's a lot of holes you could poke in it. He had the shoulder injury, whatever. We find out after the fact. But I was fine with taking that low probability chance with a high payoff. I had a number of weeks in a row where I finished in the green, and it's like, all right, well, let me give myself a chance to finish first for once, like really, really uniquely high upside build. Maybe it was bad results or bad process, but I still feel kind of okay about how I approach the slate as a whole.
Well, another thing too that I think a big mistake people make is they take guys that nobody's on, but if those guys hit, it doesn't do anything for them because these guys can hit for, your 5K quarterback that nobody's on, and they hit for 18 to 22 points. That doesn't really help you. That doesn't separate you at all. Whereas Matt Ryan could have actually hit for 26, 28, 30 points. Alec Pierce we saw Paris Campbell came out and had another big game, right? Alec Pierce could have hit for 20 plus points. I've been saying since week one, like Alec Pierce is probably going to have at least 1-2 touchdown game this year. And he's the kind of guy who could finish the season with 5 touchdowns, but a pair of 2 touchdown games, where he just doesn't score in 14 games, but in 2 of these games, he hits 2 touchdowns. And so, I think that given the way that they ended up calling that game, and then you just say, well, nothing I can do about this weekend. And I think that was a case for a lot of people, the way that the injuries shook out this weekend, which kind of, I feel like typically we spend time talking about the week behind and then sort of touch on the week ahead a little bit. But this week ahead is interesting because we've got the injury situations, right? Like Michael Carter is taking over the Jets backfield, but then they've traded for James Robinson. We've got Matt Ryan benched, and Sam Ehlinger is going to be a starting quarterback at $4K in salary, but on a team that one would think would probably lean back on the run again here. And so, any thoughts on kind of these interesting spots that we have that these injuries have set up for us?
I don't mind injury situations when it's a player is out and then you have to predict usage. And it's like, hey, if Detroit without Amon-Ra had the games they've had the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, I would have crushed. Or if Benjamin had the week he had last week, the week before that, I would have won so much more money. What bothers me with injuries is when a guy is playing and you're not really sure how healthy he is, like T. Higgins the last 2 weeks, where it's like, okay, if he's 90%, he's very in play. If he's 70%, go all in on Jamar Chase. Tyler Lockett, I think he's unique in that he's just like always played through brutal injuries and like never really performed well with an injury. Or Kamara early in the season, that drives me crazy. Whereas with like, okay, Breece Hall is out. The Jets just traded for James Robinson. I think Robinson is dusty. I don't think he's really good at this point in his career, but I'm guessing Carter gets 66% of the work, with most of that coming through the air. And maybe it's 55-45 on the ground in Robinson's favor. Like, I'm fine, just putting my chips on something like that, where, yeah, sure, I'm making this all up, but it makes sense to me. I feel good about it.
Okay. And then any thoughts on how the Colts might adjust with Matt Ryan? It seems like it was not a Frank Reich decision. It seems like it was a Jim Irsay decision, who loves being involved in their quarterback decisions. So we're going to have basically a minimum priced quarterback, which we never really get, coming in this next week, which is going to obviously significant. I don't know how much you've looked ahead to this next week, but he's going to be $4K. Travis Kelce's off the main slate. Mark Andrews is off the main slate. So the most expensive tight end is George Kittle at $5,700. So you don't have like the people spending $7,800 at tight end. And then you've got this super cheap quarterback. I think it's going to do some interesting things to salary, but then I'll obviously open up some interesting strategy moves around that, from like, okay, if everybody's doing this, if everybody's zigging, I can zag by doing something different. But any quick thoughts on that quarterback situation with the Colts?
Yeah, I'm curious how chalky is, because I think he's an amazing play. Jim Nagy, who I have a ton of respect for, the director of the Senior Bowl, continually compared him to Jalen Hurts coming out, where he's, underrated mobility, really good prototype of a quarterback. He's gotten a lot better since college. And then another person I also respect said he's just like a much worse version of Jalen Hurts. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. He's like half the price as Jalen Hurts. So that's like kind of baked in. But this preseason, he had a 10 yards per attempt average, a near perfect passer rating. He only had 4 quarters of work. He had 40.7 fantasy points, 6 rushes for 71 yards and a score. If you look at his college stats, like, sure, he's just like a round 6 pick, but if you look at his college stats, they were like identical to Trevor Lawrence, but with twice as many rushing touchdowns. It was like very similar to Robert Griffin's numbers in college. And like, I'm getting kind of excited about this 4K guy. He, much more so than Matt Ryan this preseason, Matt Ryan was like locked into running backs when he was playing. Ellinger was chucking it deep to outside wide receivers. I think this helps Pittman, and that Pittman was a poor stylistic fit for Ryan. He's not as great against man as he is against zone. So I think it helps him a little bit, but I'm really excited about Pierce, who we know is an accomplished deep threat. And Ellinger, I think, is, can chuck it deep. Obviously, what makes the most sense is, they hide him behind Jonathan Taylor, and, he has 30 touches. But I don't know. I'm bullish. I think another thing that was holding the Colts back was, Matt Ryan has 0 mobility, and Ellinger does have that. And the offensive line hasn't been good. So we could see some off-script plays. We can see some QB runs, and I think the offense could be better for it. Again, I played Matt Ryan, but I also watched Matt Ryan all season. Like, he has not played well at all, and so I don't think it's unrealistic for Ellinger to be a market improvement.
Yeah, they're playing Washington this week, which will be a really interesting game. A team that you can run or pass against. Obviously, Jonathan Taylor's price has gone down. I built a practice build last night, and granted, like I whatever my early week practice builds are, it's probably going to end up being like the chalkiest stuff of the week, because I'm just getting a sense of the slate and putting something together that's like, oh, this is how the slate shapes up. This is a sharp play. So like last week, if I'd played my first practice build, the cumulative ownership probably would have been like 200+%, because throughout the week, other people recognize, oh, this is a sharp way to build. But my first practice build last night had Ellinger and Jonathan Taylor, and then I think Alec Pierce on it, to basically say like, hey, let's just capture this offense, because I do think they'll lean on Jonathan Taylor a little bit more, but I also think Ellinger will end up being, a guy who can significantly outperform his salary. Obviously, I think he's also going to be super popular, right? So then you got to think about the other strategy angles. But given the way that the slate shapes up, spoiler alert, there's just not a lot to love at the quarterback position. Jalen Hurts is going to be 8,300, Kyler Murray 7,500, and everybody else is like below that. And they're all kind of guys where you're like, well, maybe they hit, maybe they don't. So I think if there's some viability to go into like a Kirk Cousins at, I think he's 6,100, and saying, hey, maybe he significantly outperforms Ellinger. It's not that much more in salary, and you get lower ownership. But yeah, you brought up his mobility as well. He averaged like 3.4 yards per carry in college, which obviously sucks, but he had like over 100 rush attempts
Those
per
stats
season.
are bad, by the way. Like, if you're looking at College Football Reference, they're including sack yardage, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, okay. There you go. That makes a lot more sense then. Yeah, that made very little sense to me. But 33 rushing touchdowns, and then yeah, like over 100 rush attempts per season. And so you get that mobility as well, where it's like, it's hard to beat a guy who's 4K and can run the ball, right? Even if he's held to like 25 pass attempts, he's still probably getting you 14, 15, 16 points. So yeah,
again, if he's bad, Jalen Hurts, right? It's like, how bad is he?
Yeah.
70% Hurts, because he's literally half the price.
Jalen Hurts was bad. Jalen Hurts his first few starts, and he was still worth playing. So
hell yeah. Taysom Hill was bad Jalen Hurts, and he was a DFS superstar.
Trey Lance was awful Jalen Hurts, and he still put up some big scores. So yeah, it makes for a very interesting week. But also, and I think that people tend to be like, oh, chalk, I just have to move away. But as we were talking about last week, you can have 4, 5, 6 chalky pieces on your roster if they're guys you like, and then you just have to be different in a few spots. Okay, so going back to this last week, there's some interesting spots I want to bring up to you. Cowboys offense, I think we talked about this last week. People, I think the field was kind of like, oh, Dak's back, they're going to open things up, and we were like, probably not. They're going to keep running the same offense. Sure enough, Dak threw the ball 25 times in a game that they controlled. Is that what we kind of expect moving forward, that he's game manager unless he's needed to open things up? And then also we saw Pollard outsnap Zeke this last week. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, they just do not want to give Zeke any of the receiving role. And like, yeah, I think Pollard's a significantly better receiver. It's just Zeke is a much better pass blocker, but maybe you just have Pollard running more routes. You need that sort of explosive element in your offense, and you have a running back pass blocking less frequently. I mean, but Zeke is the one with the touchdown upside, double-digit touchdown upside. I'm really just probably not going to be chasing that. And I'm not excited or bullish on the pass offense either. I think you brought this up early on, and you were just dead right. Yeah, this is not the offense it was. I think Dak was bad chalk last week. And beyond that, I think CeeDee Lamb was bad chalk because, okay, he's been smashing with this ridiculously good volume, but it was with a backup quarterback. And he's always smashed with this backup quarterback, but much less so Dak. If you look at over his last 7 games with Dak Prescott, he's averaging like 11.1 fantasy points per game. And you're like, oh, yeah, but Cooper's not there and Gallup's banged up. And it's like, okay, he had that going for him last season, and he was nothing in the second half. When realistically, Dak's guy was Dalton Schultz. And we saw that last week. Dalton Schultz, 5 catches, 49 yards, and he left early with an injury, or he missed time with an injury. And he's not close to 100%. Whereas the backup quarterback, Cooper Rush, never looked his way. And like Dalton Schultz, the tight end checkdown, seems to be Dak's guy. So in every regard, I'm pretty pessimistic on all of the key Dallas players. And I'm at a point in the season where it's much easier for me, or better for my process, where I just start crossing guys off. And
yeah,
this looks like a defense, an offense I'm just going to cross off and make things easier on myself.
Yeah, and another thing that Hilo brought up last week that I thought was really sharp was just that a quarterback like Dak is going to move through his progressions a lot more quickly than a quarterback like Rush. So you got a guy like Rush, he's going to be like, well, CeeDee Lamb's my best player, and I'll lock onto him. Whereas Dak's going to move through those progressions and find the open guy. And like you said, a lot of times that's going to be Dalton Schultz. I definitely had a lot more Schultz than CeeDee Lamb this last week at significantly lower ownership. And yeah, underexposed on the Cowboys offense because Mike McCarthy's talked about it. This is their identity is the defense. That's how they want to call games. And so unless it's a game where there's an opponent that I think can kind of force the issue against the Dallas defense, I'm going to expect this team to continue kind of playing from inside of a shell, which makes them tough to get super excited about. Okay, another team, the Packers, lost 21-23 against the Commanders. The Romeo Doubs had, I think it was 4 targets, 0 catches. Are we at a point where the Packers are just bad? And on offense, Lazard has played well, but he's priced like a not an elite wideout, but like an elite wide receiver too, right? He's priced up near like Chris Godwin and Tyler Lockett and these other guys, and he's never going to have that kind of volume or that like upside. And then Dobbs is, he's still in this Aaron Rodgers, well, he's learning things every day, he's a rookie sort of situation, and so. Is this kind of an offense that not that we've been on it heavily to this point, but I know that there's still been some Packers chalk week in and week out. Any thoughts on this offense and whether or not this is something that's going to come around for us in the second half of the season?
No, I think they're broken. I think Aaron Rodgers is hurt. I think Bakhtiari's hurt. Alan Lazard is now hurt. Sammy Watkins is added to the mix. And although, all of us think he's dust and he hasn't done anything in seven seasons now, it doesn't matter because, Rodgers wants these heady veterans who he can trust. And so there's a lot of, he's going to spread the ball around more. There's no alpha Davante Adams and the running backs too. I think AJ Dillon is just dead. Aaron Jones is interesting because we're seeing increased usage, and he does have that unique multi-touchdown upside with impressive efficiency where it can be a slate record. But who Aaron Jones has been historically is a guy you're getting negative ROI on until, the 6th week where he scores 43 fantasy points. And maybe this offense just doesn't have that potential this year. But no, this looks like a broken team to me, and another one where I think you're going to lose money if you just keep chasing it, where it's oh, it's Aaron Rodgers. Come on. So I feel like Rodgers and this next guy I want to bring up, our boy Tommy. I feel like both these guys have to be wondering why they're still playing football this season.
Buccaneers scored 3 points against the Panthers. Obviously would have been more if Mike Evans hadn't dropped that early touchdown pass, but very much out of sync. I think Brady threw 52 pass attempts to like 8 Leonard Fournette rush attempts. So it's almost like when somebody's losing in the early slate of DFS and then they're like, well, okay, I got to win all this back. I'll just get all my money on the afternoon slate. And then they lose that and they try to go overboard. They go higher volume than normal and showdown. It's almost like the Bucs are like, this isn't working. Let's just pass our way out of it. And they just keep passing the ball, not running a balanced offense, and just nothing. Some of the other offensive line isn't coming together. They're missing. I think that they're missing the kind of underneath dynamism of Antonio Brown. They're missing the safety valve, big play outlet of Rob Gronkowski. Buccaneers offense. Any thoughts there?
Yeah. So earlier this offseason, I talked about how interior pressure was always Tom Brady's kryptonite. Like the only thing that could ever make him look mortal was interior pressure. And he lost basically his entire offensive line, multiple injuries, guys retiring, leaving in free agency. And I was bullish on him coming off of that Kansas City game where he was awesome. He looked awesome, put up a ton of points. It was a bad defense. But then he gets Atlanta, whose defense is even worse. And more importantly, the worst pass rush in football. He couldn't get it done. The next week, the Pittsburgh Steelers, after just giving up like a 50-point game to Josh Allen, another bottom 3 pass rush. And I'm like, all right, lower ownership. I'm going to have some exposure. This makes a lot of sense to me. All the wide receivers are healthy. And if you look at pressure rate, they didn't really get a ton of pressure. But if you watch him on the sidelines berating his offensive line, it's clear something wasn't right. And so I think Brady is sharp in the sense that like sacks are a QB stat, and Peyton Manning is the GOAT at avoiding sacks. He checks out of things. He gets the ball out of his hands quickly. He'll throw the ball away. And so I think it's something that's not showing up in the stats, but just seeing him berate his offensive line. And then obviously like the poor production against Pittsburgh, I'm like, he lost the game. Something isn't right. Like, I'm just done with this offense for now. Although I went heavy on Chris Godwin. And then they lost 21-3 to the Carolina Panthers. They just seem broken to me. And it's like, all right, I'll fade them this week. If he goes off, whatever. I'll probably fade him the next week. He goes off, whatever. Then I'll reevaluate. But right now, yikes.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's a pretty concentrated offense at this point. Godwin had 13 targets and Mike Evans had what? Didn't Evans have like 15 targets this last week? Yep. It's a pretty concentrated offense. We know where the ball's going. We know these guys are talented. And so I've been on them each of these last 3 weeks. And my thought has been the same of like, well, ownership's getting lower. But I'm reaching a point where like ownership still hasn't been low. Ownership has been lower, but it's still one of the higher owned spots on these slates. And so, yeah, I'm at a point where I do want to still keep like any offense that has Chris Godwin and Mike Evans can blow up for a game when you're not expecting it. Brady can throw for 4 or 5 touchdown passes when people are not expecting it. But if everybody continues to expect it, then it's a spot where I'm going to probably be like, okay, you guys all chase and I'll be underweight at the most. But then if we're at a spot where like these guys are getting down sub 10% on these wide receivers, sub 8% on these wide receivers, sub 3-4% on Brady, then I might be right back there again, just because realistically it's going to happen at a spot when we're not expecting it. It's going to almost certainly happen, but I guess maybe not. Maybe it's weird because unlike the Packers, they lose Devontae Adams and all this stuff, right? The Bucs, they still have Mike Evans, they still have Chris Godwin, they still have, and Tom Brady doesn't look any worse physically. And so obviously the offensive line is a major issue, but like you brought up, Atlanta, that's why I felt so great about this spot against Atlanta and was willing to do it at high ownership. Same thing with Pittsburgh is they don't have the pass rush. They're not getting pressure. And so it shouldn't be as big of an issue, but certainly has been so far. Okay.
I also want to add to that is like, Fournette, like obviously massive slate wrecking potential, but he's been at 62% of the snaps or less in 3 of his last 4 games. And that just really like lowers his floor and increases volatility. And it seems like unpredictable volatility. Like why I love Amari Cooper is because he's the most volatile player in fantasy, but it's predictable volatility for me. He only ever does anything at home, and if he's not being shadowed by an elite cornerback. If he is, like, just do not play him and do not play him on the road. But home in a good cornerback matchup, like, yeah, let's go. And with Fournette now ceding, 40% of the work to Rachaad White, that makes me a lot less confident.
Yeah, and Fournette really, he's been popular kind of week in and week out this year, and then he hit that 30-something point DraftKings game. But if you look through his game logs, he has very few games like that. And so when a guy like that's chalky kind of week in and week out, it's a guy I typically want to avoid. And then when he puts up his 30-pointer, I'm like, well, whatever. Like, I'm also missing out on all of his 15, 18, 20-pointers. And we know that people love playing. They love playing the CeeDee Lambs, the Deontay Johnsons, the Leonard Fournettes, the guys who rarely hit for a monster game, but consistently hit like a solid game, because then they feel like, okay, this guy's not wrecking my roster. And most people don't think about, how do I get to 200 plus points? Most people are like, okay, how do I get guys who don't fail on me? How do I get guys who don't wreck my roster? And so they get their 150, 160, 175 points, whatever it is, and they're pretty happy with that. But if you're not getting these guys who can truly like break out for a monster game, you're going to have a hard time winning a tournament. So he's a guy I've typically avoided, and I'm kind of hoping people don't catch up to his snap rate going down, because now that he's not, that was really the draw for him, right? He's slow, he's overweight, he's not like shifty, he's not super powerful, but Tom Brady trusts him and he's playing a ton. And if he's not playing a ton, he loses a lot of that value there. And definitely, a guy that I'm fine staying off of as I continue to chase these pass catchers who also continue to burn me. Okay, the Ravens. So the Ravens were this super run-leaning team. And then last year, they were missing all their running backs, and they just let Lamar Jackson pass the ball. And this year, they continued to be absent their running backs. J.K. Dobbins didn't play the first couple of weeks. Gus Edwards didn't play until week 7. They've got, Mike Davis and Kenyon Drake, and then Justice Hill was slowly working his way back. Like, they don't have anybody to really trust in the backfield. All of a sudden this last week, Gus Edwards is back, and they called a game like the old Ravens. I'm pulling it up right now. Okay, Lamar Jackson had 16 pass attempts. Gus Edwards had 16 rush attempts. Justice Hill had 5. Kenyon Drake had 11. Mark Andrews had a rush attempt. Ricard had a rush attempt. Lamar Jackson had 10 rush attempts. I'm highly concerned about the Ravens passing attack moving forward, because I do think that this is how they want to play their offense, is run the ball, build the pass off of that. Now that Gus Edwards is back, we saw not just Gus Edwards rush attempts match Lamar Jackson pass attempts, but then all these other running backs still getting their touches. So any thoughts on this Ravens offense? Is this something that you think is a blip, or is this something that you think we could see continue?
No, I think you're right. Like, Lamar to me is like, what? He's 75% Kirk Cousins as a passer, like just some arbitrary discount off of Kirk Cousins. And like, Kirk Cousins is insanely frustratingly volatile, but he has those spike weeks. And so Lamar Jackson can have those massive spike weeks that he had the first 3 weeks of the season as a passer. And then he could also have these games like he's had the last 4 weeks. And why he's so valuable, so much more valuable than Kirk Cousins. He gives you a minimum of 6 rushing fantasy points with the potential for, like 20 DraftKings rushing points. But yeah, that volatility is there. And I'm sure the Greg Roman recognizes that. And like, really being that run heavy team works so effectively for them. They dominated all other teams in point differential those first few seasons of Lamar's career. And then they went back, like they let him be more pass heavy given all the running back injuries last year. And, they didn't make the playoffs. And so I could see them moving back to that. It's just, how much do you trust Gus Edwards coming off of injury? No J.K. Dobbins. So maybe I don't have a great read on it, but it wouldn't surprise me if they continue with that.
Yeah, clearly they trust him enough to give him 16 carries, which I certainly did not see coming. I thought he'd be more like, that was, like I said, I had Justice Hill on several of my Mahomes rosters, Mahomes and Kelsey rosters. and didn't pivot down because I thought, well, Gus Edwards probably gets worked in like 8 carries, and Justice Hill will get like 11, 12 carries. But it ended up being the opposite. Justice Hill got 5 carries. Gus Edwards got 16 carries. So, and realistically, Lamar Jackson had like a more consistent 30-point production type seasons when Gus Edwards was back there doing his thing. And so I don't know that it necessarily lowers Lamar's ceiling. 2020, he disappointed with a healthy backfield. 2021, he disappointed with an unhealthy backfield. He started hot this year and then has been disappointing since then. But I certainly think we could still see some, huge Lamar Jackson games. But I think that the Mark Andrews, even if you're getting a 33% target share, if they're throwing the ball 24 times, that's only 8 targets that you're getting. And so I think that that was kind of my concern heading into the season. Granted, Mark Andrews is my second highest owned player in ball, investing a 2nd-round pick, but it's like every time I took him, it was like, man, I sure hope that this doesn't end up in a situation where he's getting 6, 7, 8 targets per game, because then he's not worth the 2nd-round pick, regardless of how talented he is. I think that's something that we could be seeing moving forward. And yeah, I mean, it's risk reward, but like if I were in season long and I could shop Mark Andrews right now and be like, and get a high return, I'd be like, you know what, I might do that, just because you're looking at potentially a shifting offense where the role isn't going to be the same as it was before. And same thing in DFS, kind of looking for opportunities to maybe move off of that Mark Andrews chalk a little bit more often. I don't really have
Mark
anything
Andrews,
else. Yeah, go ahead.
He had this massive uptick in fantasy points per game where he went from 12.2 to 17.5, a 43% increase last season. And I dug into it, and it's like, okay, he actually declined in yards per route run. So what changed? He didn't have a larger route share. What changed was a massive jump in routes run per game. The Ravens were routinely the most run-heavy offense in football. And he went from 23.3 routes run per game to 38.9, a 67% increase. And so I was fading Mark Andrews all up until the Hollywood Brown trade. And then I started to slowly walk it back a little bit. I'm like, okay, he's a massive regression candidate by this one stat. But, no Hollywood Brown means probably a larger target share. And so ultimately, was pretty agnostic on him. And these past, before last week, 0 fantasy points. I was like, oh no, never mind. Like, Andrews is just a baller. He's 2K less than Justin Jefferson, but he has more fantasy points per game than Justin Jefferson since week 14 last year. And at the tight end position, those points go a much farther way. So he's like grossly mispriced. But if that happens, that's, if they revert back to their, their dropbacks per game from 2020, that absolutely crushes him. And we're seeing that with a number of key players like Atlanta. Like, they are passing as infrequently as the 1937 Steagles. Like, it's ridiculous. And so, it's killing Kyle Pitts. It's killing Drake London. Chicago, Darnell Mooney's dead. Cole Kmet is dead. And that is just such a massive point where, that could really, really crush Mark Andrews.
Yeah. And this next week I was, breaking down the slate in the Inner Circle pod this morning. And it's like, you've got so many teams that are going to want to lean on the run. Panthers and Falcons are playing each other. Both teams want to win on the ground. Bears and Cowboys are playing each other. Both teams want to win on the ground. Dolphins and Lions, realistically, that game could shoot out, but both teams do want to win on the ground. Steelers and Eagles, we know the Eagles want to win on the ground when they can. Titans, Ryan Tannehill has, I think, one game of 33 pass attempts, one of 27. Everything else has been 25 and below pass attempts. They are playing the Texans this week, who have been passing the ball, but are also willing to win on the ground if they can keep their games close. Washington and the Colts, those teams want to win on the ground. They're playing each other. So yeah, it's kind of a weird situation in the NFL. And like you said, it changes things for all the other players, all the pass catchers on these teams. And so you have to be aware of how these teams are calling their games. And I think we could very easily see the Ravens in that bucket. And I think that people will be slow to adjust to that in DFS because they're used to Mark Andrews' ceiling. They're used to his consistency. And so they don't want to think, maybe 2-3 weeks that we can get of people thinking of the Ravens the same way, and they could come out and be leaning on the run a lot more. So Ravens, we've got them against the Bucs on Thursday Night Football. Good run defense. So hopefully that kind of forces them to throw the ball a little bit more. And then by the next time they're on the main slate, we'll have people still on that passing attack and we can move over to the rushing attack.
There's been a weird debate for a number of years now where it's like people who don't know anything about analytics are like, oh my God, the Cowboys are undefeated when running the ball 25 or more times and they have a losing record. And it's just like, yeah, that's because of game script. It's like the tail wagging the dog. They're running because they have a lead. And then like the opposite of that is like the PFF running is so inefficient on an EPA per play basis. Teams need to be passing the ball all the time. And it's like, well, it kind of depends on who your quarterback is. Like, yeah, the Bengals should be passing way more than they have. But I mean, do you think, the Bears should be passing? Like they're a bad example. Like, do you think the Patriots should be passing more? Like, they don't have amazing quarterback play. And so this year, if you look at the bottom 6 teams by pass rate over expectation, it's Cleveland, Dallas, Tennessee, Giants, Atlanta, and then the Bears dead last. And these are all teams with like shockingly good win percentage, like teams who like are damn nearing their over under win total already. So I don't know why that is, but it's at least very interesting that all these teams are going shockingly run heavy and it seems to be working.
Yeah, and we've had there's a couple years ago, people look at 1 year as like a trend and they don't realize that if we look at like a bigger sample size, that trend changes. And there was a couple of years ago, I think it was, that like all the run heaviest teams were in the playoffs, right? And then like a couple of years before that, all the pass heaviest teams were in the playoffs. The thing about this is my argument with the EPA is if we're talking baseball, right? I want to maximize my run at all costs because that affects my defense in 0 ways. If I'm scoring 11 runs versus 6 runs, that doesn't hurt my defense. But in the NFL, if you're trying to just maximize points, that for a lot of these teams, like you said, depending on who your quarterback is or the composition of your team, just trying to maximize points is not your clearest path to winning that game. You have to win that game. And that's the thing, like when Zach Taylor's got Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and he's trying to like chess match his way to a victory. And it's like, bro, you don't have to do that. You can unleash Joe Burrow and you're up 3 scores, right? And then you kind of force the opponent into mistakes. But a lot of these teams, there's parity across the NFL. And so if you've got Zach Wilson at quarterback and a good defense and you're letting Zach Wilson go out there and rip it, well, what's likely to happen is he's going to make mistakes and put you in a hole. And then now you're playing from behind and trying to come back. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it's just so, like each side oversimplifies things, right? But I think that the whole idea of like, oh, every team should be passing more. And it's like, no, really, they shouldn't. Most of these teams are calling the game the way that they should be calling it for their particular personnel. And we can even look at Atlanta and as fantasy players be annoyed about Drake London and Kyle Pitts. But then also if Marcus Mariota is your quarterback and you've got what do they have, a 3-4 record calling Marcus Mariota has thrown, I think it's 27 combined passes the last 2 weeks, right? Like if that's your clearest path to winning, then that's what you got to do with that guy at quarterback. Obviously you're playing the Bengals, you're down 3 scores early. You should probably pass the ball a little bit more. But yeah, generally speaking, I think that type of thinking bleeds into our thoughts. And it's like, oh, well, everybody should be passing. And then as fantasy players, we want that to happen. But realistically, for most of these teams, that shouldn't be the case. And it's not going to be the case. And so we need to be aware of that. And I think the Ravens are probably falling into that bucket moving forward. It'll be interesting to keep an eye on. But yeah, and a lot of these teams want to be winning on the ground, either because they've got a good defense or because they want to hide their quarterback or they've got a good run game. And that's just the nature of, I don't think it's a macro trend in the NFL so much as that's the composition of a lot of these teams at the moment. And so that's what we're dealing with in a lot of these games. Do you have any other thoughts from this last week, from the week ahead? I don't really have anything else, but we got a few minutes left if we want to hit on anything else on your end.
No, I don't think so. Just like the opposite of the Ravens is like Joe Burrow is going to be a league winner. All the pass catchers are going to be league winners. That, again, like the whole concern with them was, is Zach Taylor going to be a donkey and go massively run heavy? And the last 2 weeks, far and away, led the league in pass rate over expectation. In games, they're just like basically top 10 in pass rate over expectation. Joe Burrow averages 32.2 fantasy points per game. The Bengals have 6 wins, 2 losses in those games. All other games, just 8 wins, 7 losses. So the Bengals, to me, like, okay, the Ravens are going in a run heavy direction. Bengals are going in the pass heavy direction. And like one of my worst takes from last season was someone messaged me on Discord and they're like, this guy sent me a trade. He wants one of my quarterbacks. Would you trade Joe Burrow or this other quarterback? And I was like, yeah, Bengals are just too run heavy. Trade Joe Burrow. And then like from that point on, they flipped a switch, and Burrow was just an all-time league winner down the stretch. And I think we're going to see that again.
Yeah, I would love that. I mean, I like Zach Taylor as like a coach, but not as a play caller and game manager, if that makes sense. And like, I think that he gets the guys to play for him. I think he understands his team well. He understands how to manage a season and all that. But the fact that he's finally like, okay, maybe it's better to let Joe Burrow pass the ball, I think that could be an exciting team down the stretch, because these teams, Kansas City, Buffalo, if Cincinnati starts falling into that bucket now, with so many teams skewing toward the run, the handful that skew toward the pass become even more powerful for fantasy, because we know that the volume is going to be there. And that's kind of why, like, I probably won't fully give up on the Buccaneers offense, is because they're passing the ball so much that eventually there's going to be a game where it happens. Right. But yeah, there's so many offenses that are just not calling games that way, that the small handful who do, they're cheat codes in a way. Obviously, you'd prefer the Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow rosters over the Tom Brady current Buccaneers ones. But yeah, I mean, these teams that are going to pass the ball, you certainly got to pay attention to them. So, all right, cool. Yeah, I've got nothing else. So, Scott, as always, it's fun to hang out. I will see you back here next week. Listeners, thanks for hanging out. We will see you back here next week, and we'll see you at the top of the leaderboards this weekend.